Welcome to the Economic Rockstar Podcast with your host, Frank Conway, connecting brilliant minds in economics and finance.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Economic Rockstar Podcast. On this week's episode, I am joined with Dr. Rady Markowitz, recipient of the Nobel Prize in Economics in memory of Alfred Nobel in 1990. To many of you, there's probably no need for an introduction on Rady Markowitz, as you would be quite familiar with his work, especially in finance. But there are a number of insights that I got from this conversation with Rady that I wasn't actually quite familiar about. And I suppose in preparation of this conversation I had with Rady, there was a number of things that I've only discovered about Rady and his work prior to academia. And this is something that he'll discuss in this episode with me. And 1952 was a significant year for Rady, in which he wrote 3 papers, 2 of them known as The Utility of Wealth and the other Portfolio Selection, actually catapulted him into academic fame, if you want to call it. And it was the Portfolio Selection paper that gave him the award for the Nobel Prize in 1990. But the Utility of Wealth paper was one in which Kahneman used to develop the idea of prospect theory. And Dr. Markowitz informed me that it was his initial love of philosophy as a young kid growing up, and it was his readings on Aristotle and Plato and Hume and Descartes, Charles Darwin and Kant and Bertrand Russell that gave him those philosophical insights in human behaviour. So in this episode, it was something similar to the format that I took with Vernon Smith, also a previous winner of the Nobel Prize. And we discussed his life growing up as a child and as a teenager. He was born in 1927, very similar to Vernon Smith, and that was at the beginning of the Great Depression. So we talked a bit about that, his interests and activities, college, and why he actually ended up in economics, or how he did end up in economics, and what his dissertation was. And he also talked about some of his work with Rand Corporation, which helped him further develop his mathematical thinking and algorithms. And there are a number of names that are mentioned, again familiar with some of you, such as Milton Friedman, James Tobin, Tversky, Kahneman, and Hersh Sheffrin. And also in this episode, Rady has recommended a number of books and also have informed us of some of the books that he feels were critical in his formative years. The episode may be a little different than what you might expect, in which maybe we should talk more about portfolio selection, the capital market line, but Rady would have talked about this in past interviews and in articles. But I just felt that it would be quite useful to take a slightly different angle and look at the person, the human person, and who Rady is. And after all, this is what the essence of this podcast is about. It's about the person and what they actually bring to us in the field of economics. So if you want to check out all the links, books and resources mentioned in this episode with Rady, please check out economicrockstar.com/Rady Markowitz. Or in the search bar within the Economic Rockstar website, just type in Rady and that should bring you to the page with all those links. And again, if you haven't done so already, make sure you subscribe on your favourite podcast platform such as Apple Podcasts. That way you'll never miss a future episode. You'll always get the notification and you can download if you wish. Again, if you know of anybody who might be interested in this episode or any other previous episode, please share it, and you'll be doing this podcast a huge favour. It'll make people more aware of what's available. And if you'd like to support the show financially, check out patreon.com/Economic Rockstar, in which you can support the show for as little as $1 per month. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode with Rady Markowitz.
Asking the question, what do we know and how do we know it, which is a philosophical question, is what made me do something which changed economics.
Hello, Dr. Markowitz. Welcome to the Economic Rockstar Podcast.
Thank you.
It's such an honor to actually have you on for the work that you've done to economics or finance. You know, I know there were quite a thin line back in the 1950s when you did your dissertation. And yep. I'd love to explore that aspect of your life, but if it's okay, if I could take the liberty to refer to you as Rady.
Oh, please do.
And maybe if you could take us back to your formative years, your younger life. You were born in 1927, so you just born just prior to the Great Depression.
August 24th, 1927. Now, my folks owned a grocery store, so we always ate well. Now, sometimes if there was leftover green beans, Mother would make up a big batch of green beans with onions and potatoes. And next door was in fact, there was a opening you could walk through from, eventually from my father's house to, from my father's store, his grocery store, to the meat market next door. And then there was a screen that could be pulled across it if one was open, the other wasn't. So we ate well. I was an only child. I think Mother had problems with childbirth. So I read. I always had enough, money to buy books and listen to music. So as far as I was concerned, personally, I sort of missed it. I didn't realize there was a Great Depression.
Is that because everybody was in the same boat in terms of how they were affected by it, or was it that you were well protected from it?
You have to visualize, I'm in a upper middle class or middle class to upper middle class neighborhood. Everybody in that neighborhood owned their own homes. Some of them may have been having problems, but I never saw them. My father owned a grocery store. Everybody that came in the grocery store was well dressed, for schlepping around the neighborhood, for just mucking around the neighborhood. And as far as I was concerned, there never was a depression.
Okay. So it was a neighborhood, or would you think people had self-pride that they didn't want to reveal the effects of the Great Depression they had on their lives, or was it just the area?
At the maximum, there was, now first, 1927, I was a child. By 1939, I would have been 12 years old. So I was a child. I was living in a neighborhood where everybody had owned their own homes, or were duplexes. The people who came into my father's grocery stores was let's suppose that at the heart there was 10-12% unemployment, but not where I lived.
When you said you had a lot of books that you read, what would have drawn your interest, or who would have drawn your interest to what topics?
I became a reader early in life. At the age of about 14, I just happened to read Darwin's Origin of Species, and I was just absolutely fascinated by the way he marshaled his evidence. If you've never read it, it's really a very systematic account of, stating your hypothesis and putting your evidence together and so on. Very impressive. From then on, I read I read science at a popular level, like the ABC of Relativity, but I read philosophy. I read Aristotle, Plato. Hume was my favorite. Also Descartes. What do we know, and how do we know it? I think, therefore I am. That kind of stuff. I lived 9 miles from downtown Chicago, so I would walk, on a weekday in the summer when I wasn't, helping Dad in the grocery store, when I began working in the grocery store Saturdays. And so I would walk to downtown. There were these stands with great Chicago hot dogs and Chicago tomatoes and stuff like that. So I'd have 2 or 3 hot dogs, or maybe 4 hot dogs in the course of 9 miles. And then I would, there were bookstores, used bookstores you could get for 50 cents or $1, Origin of Species, I'm thinking of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, or Hume's Inquiry into this or that. And then there were Art Institute, the Field Museum, the Shedd Aquarium, the Planetarium, Adler Planetarium. And then what drove me down was the outdoor concerts, the Saturday concerts, and then going back, I'd ride the streetcar. It was idyllic. For a nerd, it was just an idyllic setting.
And this was something that you were well exposed to, or you were well aware of, so you were drawn to all this type of life, whereas perhaps other people may have not seen what you had seen and gone down a different route altogether.
Yes, everybody, it's environment and your genes, and there's a phrase but I'm blocking. But for example, my closest, I was what we call a nerd now. My closest friends were another nerd who became a professor of chemistry and retired when he was 65 at a sensible age, and now lives still alive and lives in back east in the Boston area. And I came to California State, became a Californian, so he and I still correspond. I had a girlfriend who became my first wife, and she's no longer with she's. We divorced, and B, she also is now deceased. So other people, in that same neighborhood, Conrad Jankowski and me were the only ones and Luella Johnson went in one direction, and everybody else went in another direction.
And it was a time when you hit your 20s. Would you have been pressurized to enlist into the Army in the United States?
Well,
or was academic life?
I became 18 towards the end of the war. I was born August 24th, 1927. You can figure out whether, I think VE Day had already happened and VJ had not. I had a small, what's called a polynidal cyst, which was removed later in an office, little outpatient surgery, so there was no big deal to have removed it but they were at a point in time where they could see they were about to discharge people instead of enlist people, and being not quite right. They said I was 4F. So if I had been drafted, I would have, been. I probably, since my hobby was cryptography, I probably would have ended up in cryptography instead of infantry. But that's an alternate life that one can only conjecture about.
That's true. And you were actually into cryptography at the time. Do you think that would have set you up for your love of mathematics and problem solving? No,
I think it's a symptom. The fact that I read Darwin's Origin of Species and was just absolutely enamored of Hume and Descartes, and still am. I'm writing a 4-volume book. I suppose we'll mention eventually. Yes. Volume 1 was single period, decision under risk and uncertainty. Volume 1, single period, known odds. Volume 2, these are in print. Volume 1 and Volume 2 are in print, called Risk and Return and the Theory and Practice of Rational Investing, but it really means rational decision making. Volume 2, many period known odds, and Volume 3 is the uncertainty case, and we get into the philosophers and so on. What do we know and how do we know? And Volume 4 will be applications. But did I wander off from your question? Probably did.
No, Harry, with all this love of philosophy and cryptography, why economics? What happened?
That's a great question. I went to the University of Chicago, and my grades were not super great because, for example, in algebra, if the teacher assigned us 30 problems, the first 29 were boring. She would say, I remember Mrs. McGrady said, "Oh, Harry, if you could just do your homework, I could give you an A. You get 100 on your test, but you don't turn in your homework." Well, the first 29 were just doing the same thing over and over again and with different words, and the 30th would be hard, and all the A students would come to me and say, "How do I solve this?" And I'd solve it for them. So I was somehow tedium has never been. Tedium is the enemy. So when I went to the University of Chicago, I said, my grades are not super, but I read all these philosophers, and I read science at a popular level like the ABC of Relativity, I said. And they said, well, we usually don't take people in who are at your level in high school, but we'll let you take the entrance exam. Well, it turns out that the entrance exam was not only a can you get in? But it was a placement exam. How much do you already know about certain fields? Well, it turned out that my popular reading, I had learned on my own as much of the physical sciences as they were going to teach teach the other. So they said, you don't have to take the survey course on the physical sciences. So but I did take the survey course on the social sciences, including economics. At that time, the Hutchins Adler program was one of everybody should learn, the social sciences, the physical sciences, the humanities, and so on and so forth. And so I took these and they taught these survey courses over 2 years. You got a PhD, Bachelor of Philosophy. Anyway, so when I took an economics course in my survey of the social sciences, and it fascinated me. The combination of mathematics and empiricism fascinated me. And so when I graduated and I had to go and pick a upper division, I forgot about my love of the physical sciences, especially what's now called cosmology. And I just went into the economics department. The rest was history.
Exactly, yeah. And we know that history because in 1952, you wrote a paper on utility, on portfolio selection.
Yes, and you're about to say 1952 is a good year for me. I wrote 3 papers, co-wrote one. One was called Portfolio Selection, and that's my famous one. A second one was called Utility of Wealth, and it's the paper which Kahneman and Tversky read when they formulated their prospect theory. And if you read Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, the actual relation, the moment they said, oh, yes, Markowitz's old 1952, then 25-year-old paper has the key to explaining their experiments. And then basically it said what Kahneman got out of my paper was, if you're trying to explain behavior, don't put utility to wealth, put utility to change in wealth, and it has a certain shape and so on. And then there was a paper that I co-wrote with Leo Goodman. I did most of the work, but we put our names alphabetically, Goodman and Markowitz, on Ken Arrow's paradox. And that's still in use. It's still quoted. All these are still quoted.
That's a seminal paper, Portfolio Selection. I know, based on what you're saying, their utility of wealth is too when it comes to the behavioral sciences. But it's the portfolio selection that was pretty much groundbreaking in terms of the revelations that you have discovered that wasn't actually practiced in reality.
Well, it turns out, I have a client called Loring Ward, and they did a sort of a party in my honor, and they produced a document which I call Markowitz's 14 Biggest Hits. I've continued to. A lot of people think that my creativity only applied to portfolio selection, but my field is actually operations research, and I've done miscellaneous things. Several groundbreaking things in the field of operations research, which, if your listeners don't know what that is the application of mathematics and statistics and simulation and so on to practical government problems and private enterprise problems. What should our objectives be, and how do we meet those objectives, and what models seem to work, and how should we use them, and so on. That's operations research, and that's my field, not portfolio theory.
Your work on operations research actually helped you bring about the California Analysis Center too.
Well,
I probably jumped a bit ahead chronologically there, actually. So,
well, let's bring you up. Let's fill in the missing. When I was at the University of Chicago, I went into the economics department. I did well and was invited to the Coles, COWL's Coles. I guess it's supposed to be Cowles, but Coles Commission. The Coles Commission was the leading econometric location, the most creative econometric Charlie Koopmans was there. He got a Nobel Prize. Ken Arrow was there. He got a Nobel Prize. I was there, and I got a Nobel Prize. Hurwitz got a Nobel Prize. And so you would think from the number of Nobel Prizes that came from it, I would think University of Chicago Economics Department in total is outstanding in terms of the number of the percentage of the Nobel Prizes per capita, and of those, most come from the Coles Commission as compared to Milton Friedman and his crowd. So I went to the University of Chicago Economics Department on that fluke of being dismissed and not having to take the physical science survey courses. Once I got into the economics department and they saw my abilities in math, statistics, economics, econometrics, I got invited into the Coles Commission. When I got to the point where I had to choose a college, I got an offer from Brown University, and I went to the head of the economics department, who was Ted Schultz, who later became the Secretary of State under Reagan. But he was the head of the economics department at that time. And I mean, who I was and what I did, he must, certainly either he knew anyway or the Coles Commission set him straight. So I got an offer, from $4,000, which was a starting salary from Brown University. I went to Ted Schultz, Professor Schultz. He said, "Don't sell yourself short." Then I got an offer from the Rand Corporation for $6,000, and I took it. And again, it must have been Rand went to Coles and said, "Who do you got?" They say, "We got Markowitz." They said, "We'll take him." Oh, so, and then at some point the rest, I'm trying to get to CACI. So I spent 9 years with Rand, and then I was bid away by General Electric Company, and then I went back to Rand. But at some point in time, I got interested in simulation, Monte Carlo simulation. I also was the head of, I also did the design of a Rand Corporation man-machine computer simulation where Air Force officers pretend like they're Air Force officers, and the computer did sorties and had aircraft out of commission for parts and aircars out of commission for maintenance and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so I led a long, complex life, but somewhere along the way, Herb Carr, we did a programming language called SIMSCRIPT. Mm-hmm. So that's another. I got a prize from the TIMS, the Operations Research Society of America, and the Institute of Management Science, a year before Nobel. And they gave it for three things I did. One was portfolio theory. A second was sparse matrix techniques. These are large systems, linear programming systems, for example, but large systems of equations, most of whose elements are zero. So if you do it right, you can, and then if you do it right, you can solve huge problems like the electrical power industry now uses this, transmission. And then finally, the SIMSCRIPT simulation programming language. And that became my career. At some point, in fact, a friend of mine, Herb Carr, had always tried to talk me into business, and I said, no, thanks. And then when Bernie Hausner programmed the SIMSCRIPT simulation program, and Herb Carr wrote the manual, because he needed a job. He had been dismissed from his prior place. Well, we produced something called SIMSCRIPT, a simulation programming language. And when the manual was free, we said, okay, Herb kept saying, let's go into business. And I said, okay, let's go into business. Can't be harder than writing a compiler. It was, but that's okay. That's another. So I was at CACI for a long while.
Hardy, you mentioned quite a few noticeable names there earlier on. And one of those, Milton Friedman, who would he have been one of your dissertation external examiners?
The Milton Friedman story?
Yeah, I'd love you to share it with the rest of us, though.
Okay. Let me blow my nose and take a breath and get a sip of coffee. So I was working at the Rand Corporation, and that's a think tank for the Air Force, was at that time. And they have a Washington, D.C., or an Arlington, Virginia office, as well as their main office in Santa Monica. And I was flying back from Washington to Santa Monica, and I landed at Midway. There was no O'Hare then. I remember when I landed, I thought, for the purpose of defending my dissertation and getting the PhD, I had left with all the dissertation finished, and left Chicago with all but. So I thought to myself, I know this subject cold. Not even Milton Friedman is going to give me a hard time. So hang on a second. And I'm going to make a very loud noise, which you will edit out. Mm-hmm. It says ring for coffee, but I really want a glass of water. Hang on.
All right.
I hope that didn't deafen you. What? No. Water. Agua.
That's a good old-fashioned technique, isn't it? Ring the bell.
Oh, I have this bell. Ring for coffee.
I can't edit that out. I must leave it in if that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. That is just fine. You have to come visit this office. I have a suite of 4. Thanks a million. I have two secretaries and me. So we each have an office, and then there's a conference room, and it's decorated to my taste. Most of the walls are covered with bookcases, which are filled with books. But so it's a very comfy place. So I give these talks, and the girls close the door, but they know sometimes I need a warm up or a refill, and I ring. So what are we discussing?
You were flying in to defend your thesis, but you knew a cold, and you were going to be talking to the likes of Milton Friedman.
Well, I was going to defend my dissertation, and Friedman said, Harry, I've read your dissertation, but it's and I don't find any bugs in it. But this is not economics, and we can't give you a PhD in economics for a dissertation that's not economics. And it's somebody. So the next, I began to sweat. I tell you,
he did that intentionally, did he?
I met him later. So wait, let me tell the story, and then I'll tell the rest of the story. So at one point he says, Harry, you have a problem. It's not economics. It's not mathematics. It's not business administration. Dear Marsha Yashak, who was the head of my committee, shook his head and said, it's not literature. And anyway, so after, 45, 50, 60 minutes of him telling me I wasn't going to get a PhD in economics, I stepped out in the hallway, and about 5 minutes later, Dr. Marshak comes out and says, congratulations, Dr. Markowitz. Okay. Anyway, so 10, 15 years later, Friedman and I are on the same project together. And I reminded him of the story. It was no big deal in his life. But I asked him, was he serious? He says, we never flunk anybody at that stage. So, no, he wasn't serious. One free shot at a wise guy.
Yeah. Like it's just putting into perspective there. It is amazing that you've grown up with John Maynard Keynes being the main economist at the time when you were born, to meeting and discussing work with Milton Friedman, who everybody on the outside would have seen as two different types of economic disciplines or schools.
Well, remember, I was with the Coles Commission, and we'll consider right now there's a big dichotomy between rational, mean variance, rational decision making, and behavioral. But I claim, and the behavioral folks say, I claim to be the father of portfolio theory and the grandfather of behavioral finance. And in fact, Hirsch Sheffrin has a 3-volume book on behavioral finance. Volume 3 is readings. The first one in there is my Markowitz Utility of Wealth. And it says this is truly a behavioral finance. And it's, in fact, one of my clients, I mentioned before, Loring Ward, there was a behavioral finance guy, and he says, Harry, you have these 2 children, portfolio theory and utility of wealth. Why do you give all your time and attention to portfolio theory? I say, that's the way I make a living. And he said, I make a living out of the other one. And I say, you work your side of the street, I'll work my side of the street. There was a paper by Friedman and Savage that came out that I read. I don't know whether Friedman assigned it or it was just out. It was optional. I don't know whether it was mandatory optional reading. Maybe it was mandatory reading for the Friedman's micro class. Hold on a second. And it said, here is a utility function which explains both the fact that people insure, so that's risk avoidance, and they buy lottery tickets, which is risk-seeking. And how do you explain that? So they had a curve with wealth on the x-axis and utility on the y-axis, and it sort of looked like a two-humped camel walking uphill. So there's a concave, risk-averse part, then a convex, risk-seeking part, then again a concave part. So I read that, and I said, this two-humped camel going uphill, take a plank, and you get 2 tangents. Below the lower tangent, you're poor. Above the upper tangent, you're super rich, and between them, you're sort of in between. You're middle. Now, take 2 people. This is by 2 of my heroes, Milton Friedman and Leonard J. Savage. Great minds, but I just read and I think, and I figure it out for myself. So take two people which are halfway between tangent 1 and tangent 2, using the apparatus, the analytic apparatus that Friedman and Savage tell us about, and you can figure out from scratch, that there's no fair bet. And I'd rather do this than the status quo. There's no fair bet that these 2 individuals would prefer to engage in, where they flip a coin and one becomes rich, almost, at this upper borderline, and one becomes poor at the lower borderline. Well, you don't see middle-class people flipping coins. One becomes rich and one becomes poor. And below the lower line, you never buy lottery tickets. And if the poor people don't buy lottery tickets, who's lining up in front of me when I'm trying to buy a Wall Street Journal on 3rd Avenue in New York, and so on? So this thing just didn't work. And but the only guy that made any sense was near a particular inflection point. So you're conservative on the downside and risk-taking on the upside until you become conservative again. That became the utility of wealth, and that's and again, the insight happened very quickly in that case. And then the SIMSCRIPT simulation programming language is still in existence and still works.
That kind of relates to your work on portfolio selection. Because the way you described that two-humped camel going uphill, right, it almost looks like the lending portfolio and the borrowing portfolio to the left and right of the tangent.
No, that's not right. No. If you are in the concave portion, my observation was if you were permanently in the convex portion, you'd be a risk seeker, you'd gamble yourself out of that portion. Mm-hmm. So my explanation was the inflection point is usually your current wealth. Of course, if you have a recent windfall gain, you go into the convex region. If you have a recent windfall loss, you go into the concave, you become more. Now, the follow-up work on my portfolio theory the following work on my utility of wealth was done by the prospect theory, the behavioral finance guys. The follow-up work on my portfolio selection was in my 1959 book. Now, what's the difference between my 1959 book and my 1952 article? I had been somewhere in parallel to writing 1952. I had read much of von Neumann's theory of games and economic behavior, von Neumann and Morgenstern, I should say. And there's an appendix in there about expected utility. There's an art which didn't convince me, but there's an article by Marshak about why you should follow the expected utility maxim, and that convinced me. Leonard J. Savage also convinced me that when you don't know known odds, you should act using probability beliefs. You should maximize expected utility using probability beliefs where there are no objective, and then you update this beliefs according to Bayes' rule. So in 1959, I had the following, or it was really 54, 55 when I wrote the book on Leave from Rand, located at Yale University. So I had this problem. On the one hand, I was peddling portfolio selection, and on the other hand, I believed in expected utility using probability beliefs. So the question was, how do you reconcile them? So there's a lot of work that started with my 1959 book on mean variance approximations to expected utility, and it's got to be a concave, risk-averse expected utility for mean variance to be a good approximation. And in 1959, with a few cases, I found that, it's a quite robust approximation. Later, Chaim Levy, H-A-I-M Levy, and Markowitz did very extensive experiments with different kinds of utility functions, different probability distributions, and in fact, mean variance is a very robust approximation to expected utility. And there's a whole literature that follows that the people who write textbooks don't seem to know about, which says yes, mean variance approximation. I start the volume 1 of my current 4 volumes set, of which volume 1 and volume 2 are published, and volume 3 is in process. I speak of the great confusion, the confusion between the necessary and sufficient conditions for using, if you believe in expected utility, for using a mean variance frontier, picking a point from the mean variance frontier. And the Gaussian distributions or quadratic utility is a sufficient conditions, but we can easily reject Gaussian return distributions, and nobody has an actual quadratic utility. It reaches a maximum, goes in the wrong direction. But you can talk about mean variance approximations to expected utility, and in fact, that's very robust. Levy and Markowitz found, and the subsequent literature confirmed that.
And for those people who are unsure of mean variance and the portfolio selection, you can let me know if I'm describing it incorrectly, if you don't mind, but it's where you decide to look at the returns of, say, stocks. And if you have 2 portfolios of stocks and they give you the same return, but one has a lower risk, you choose the one with the lower risk. Or if the 2 of them have the same risk profile, but one of them has a higher return, you choose that portfolio as one that will give you maximum utility, if you like to say that.
Well,
and this could
the utility. There's 2 different things, criteria. One is mean variance, and another is expected utility. We'll come back to mean variance, but expected utility says the way you should make a decision, single period decision, and let's not worry about how single and multiple relate, the multiple period, to each possible outcome, money outcome or success of your marriage or where to go, to each possible outcome, you assign a number called its utility. So there's a utility assigned to winning $100, a utility assigned to losing $100, and a utility to not playing the game, since people, in fact, are averse to just flipping a coin 50-50 for winning or losing, or let's say any large amount like $1,000 or $1 million, $1,000. The utility function must be cautious, must be risk averse, which means it has to be shaped concavely. Okay, so there's the expected utility maxim, and then there's mean variance. Mean is average return, variance is the square of the standard deviation of return. So one has to do with, mean variance has to do with just average return and volatility of return. And expected utility assigns possibly a different number to every possible outcome. And John von Neumann, inventor of the modern computer and many other things, the game theory and so on, he didn't first propose expected utility. That goes back to Daniel Bernoulli, but he gave an axiomatic, systematic justification for it, which put it back into vogue. Anyway, so the expected utility maxim was all the vogue in, and it still is, on the theory of rational decision making in the face of known odds, and mean variance was just a different kind of thing. So I believed in expected utility, but I was peddling mean variance, and so I started saying, isn't mean variance a practical way in the real world where you can approximately maximize expected utility, and various calculations with real numbers and different utility functions says yes, it's quite robust.
And the thing is, you did mention there that you're looking at a one-period model.
No. Wait a minute. Oh. Let me quote the title of a paper which I wrote with the co-author called Single Period Mean Variance Analysis in a Changing World. Okay. And this has to do with a field called dynamic programming, which has to do with, in order to maximize expected utility for the game as a whole, you have to maximize a sequence of one period analysis of expected utility. You move one step at a time. And there's a field called dynamic programming, which figures out, among other things, what is the utility function you should maximize for this move in order to maximize expected utility for the game as a whole. And that's all in that's all in my volume 2 of the 4-volume book I'm writing.
Can I ask you, Hardy, you've witnessed so many events in terms of cyclical moves of the stock market over time, and people still get it wrong, or the market surprises them. They max out on risk in order to maximize their potential levels of return, or they might want to squeeze that extra 1% and ramp up their risk profile. And we see that time and time again with, say, the tech bubble, the financial crisis, and who knows what's next. But why do we get it wrong? Do other investors remain somewhat static in terms of their approach, and they look at a period of time and they buy and hold stocks, and others, based on your experience in behavioral finance side of things, are there behaviors that cannot be modeled in this risk and this mean variance profile that you've established?
Well, let's think about who makes money. People who rode the market up in 2008, I guess, let's say, and then lost money when it came crashing down. I think March 2008 was bad. I think it hit a peak at late 2007, and it hit a trough in March of 2009. So 2008 was.
Today is actually the 10-year anniversary of the Lehman Brothers collapse, I think.
Oh, that's nice. Well, my people made money. Okay. I mean, you should ask what about the Markowitz bet. I also invest, okay, and doing very nicely, thank you, and I'll tell you about it. Right. Where does the money go? If somebody loses money, somebody must be making money. It's a zero-sum game except for a few pennies that the brokers get. Well, there's two. I have a talk that I give called Outperformance, and I talk WISC and WASC, with information, special information, without special, with special knowledge and without special knowledge. But let's think about the really big free lunch in economics is not diversification. Diversification always is a good thing if you're risk averse. If you're risk prone, if you like risk, you should put all your money in, put all your eggs in one basket and roll it. But there's something called rebalancing, and maybe your clients, your listeners don't know, but it's a very important concept. I keep reaching for water. Maybe about 3:00, I may run out of breath and ask you to wind it up. But hold on a second. Let me take a drink of water. That's 3:00 my time. I don't know what.
It's 11:00 p.m. my time here.
All I visited Dublin. I was in England. I visited Dublin, and I remember the Guinness there is the greatest. Yes. And you have peat bogs or something around the hills, or I can't remember. Beautiful little town of Dublin is. Anyway, so I was at Trinity. I gave a lecture at Trinity College, and we ate at high table like Harry Potter, and I drank this. Wonderful. You get to be 91, you have all these memories. Okay, but Frank, remind me of what you
were on about your WISC and your WISC and WASC talk that you were giving.
Okay, well, this basically the story is that there are two kinds of people. People who buy when the market goes up on the assumption that it's going to go up forward more, and sell when the market goes down on the assumption it's going to go down more, and people who rebalance. Now, what is the concept of rebalancing? Suppose you decided you wanted a 60-40 mix of stocks versus bonds. Now, if the market goes up enough, it's no longer 60-40. It's, the market. Let's say the stocks go up, and let's suppose it's cash instead of bonds, and these stay the same. And as the stocks go up, you no longer have 60-40. You have 70-30. Now, if you sell the right amount, you bring the 70-30 back to 60-40. Now, when it comes back down again, it's at 60-40. When it comes back down to sort of where the trend line is, it's no longer 60-40. It's 50-50. You buy enough to bring it back to 60-40. And what you are buying is the shares that you sold at a higher price. And conversely, when it goes down too much, you have to buy. And then if it comes back to its normal, what its trend is, its trend line, then it's you repurchase. But you're buying high. You're selling high and buying low. You are on the other side of the folks who buy when the market goes up and sell when the market goes down. So just rebalancing. Rebalancing is a sure free lunch. If the market's going up, you're going up faster than the market. If the market if the market is going straight, if you have something like Russian imperial bonds, that's going to zero, then you just go to zero with it. But if it's a viable market like S&P 500 or stocks, whatever, it's stocks versus bond, U.S., it's just great. So let me tell you about the Markowitz bet, and then maybe we should wrap it up.
Yeah.
I'm usually a passive investor because you have to play the hand that's dealt with you, including what knowledge you have. And I do not have the wherewithal or the background to evaluate individual stocks like Warren Buffett has or David Swensen has, David Swensen being the CIO of Yale University and having written a book called Pioneering Portfolio Selection. And he uses mean variance. He uses, he does a mean variance analysis at the asset class level, but he has asset classes like private placement and forests with predicted for it. The asset classes I couldn't touch as David Swensen's book. Anyway, so I usually don't have any information, any private information, but in August of 2017. A storm did great damage to Houston, and I didn't do anything. Then another storm did great damage to Florida, and then after that there was Puerto Rico, and now there's some who knows what. But when the Florida one happened, I took all my bonds except my TIA, whatever, and went into equities. The interest rates were very low then. It took me a while to figure out that you're getting zero interest rate and you defer that, you're still not getting anything. So it took a while to figure I should also do it with my tax deferred accounts, my IRA and that kind of stuff. So first I went one-third to big cap, small cap, and emerging market. And then I said, no. Let's take the big cap and put it into the things that are going to be needed to reconstruct Puerto Rico, for example, or Florida or Houston. And that I went into lumber, which is Weyerhaeuser, glass, which is Corning, bulldozers, which is suddenly I can't remember. Caterpillar, 3M, and United Technology, which is elevators that get up and what you need to breathe in an office and get up and down in an office and so on. And these have done very well. The stock market keeps making new highs. I will start to rebalance when the interest rate on long-term munis, fixed income for me is either tax deferred or it's munis. And you have your tax problems, we have our tax problems. Anyway, and I keep checking every now and then when the interest rates so I can get 4% on a long-term muni, California muni, then I'll start rebalancing. So far so good. It's almost as if I knew what I was doing, as my wife and I used to say.
Yeah, and that muni is going to be happening quite shortly, I'd say, because the Fed rate has gone up quite substantially.
And the inflation has to start.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it turns out that before you have lumber, you need a carpenter, and it takes longer to produce carpenters than it does to gear up the gear up the lumber supply. But that's just all detail. So so far so good in my own portfolio.
And I guess it helped that lumber prices have reached pretty much a low over the last number of years as well as an input for these firms.
Yeah, there was, when I went into this, I look back and I somehow stumbled in a propitious moment that the things I was investing in were making lows back in September of 2017, and now little by little they've got to rebuild. They got to rebuild all this stuff eventually, and it takes longer.
Is it okay if I ask you, I'm respectful of your time, is it okay if I ask you a number of quick-fire questions, if that's okay, Hardy?
Okay. Let's say 3:15 my time is about when I should get my nose back to my grindstone.
That's fine.
But I'll try. You can ask them quick. I'll try very hard to keep the answers quick fire.
Yeah, it's okay. If you're well aware of Back to the Future, the movie, and the DeLorean, if you could step into that DeLorean and time travel, who would you like to meet, or what era would you like to go back to?
Oh, that's easy. Aristotle.
Okay. And is this because of the foundation of Western civilization and knowledge?
I mean, he was absolutely awe-inspiring. I mean, look at all the fields he touched. Not only did he do there's a 6-volume put together later by one of his students on logic. There's the prior analytics, posterior analytics. There's a couple of volumes. That's 3 and 4 of the organum. I don't think I'm pronouncing it right. But there's categories, and he was in every field. He was just an absolute genius.
If you have a book recommendation, and I'll put the links to your books on my own website, economicrockstar.com/Harry Markowitz, but is there 1 or 2 books you'd like to recommend that have taken, I suppose, I know you mentioned a couple of them, Charles Darwin, but a finance book that might be quite a good read?
No, I will tell you, not a finance book, but a book that everybody in finance is absolutely imperative. Extraordinary. Charles Mackay, I think his name is.
Yes, it is.
Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds.
Yes, I actually recommended that to my students 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, there's three books that if you did a history of the world, Adam Smith, division of labor and wide markets. If you ask yourselves, why did civilization in the West start in Mesopotamia? Because Mesopotamia was on two rivers, and it was on the Mediterranean, and so you would have these Phoenicians, peddling their work, picking up cedars in Lebanon and gold and so on. Or you can go back to the silk routes of, and again, this also has to do with, wide markets. So Adam Smith is on my list. Extraordinary Popular Delusions is on my list. And On War, von Clausewitz, On War.
On War.
And I would teach, if I write a book on, if I have time, if the Lord gives me time to write a history book after I finish volume 4 of the current book, it's going to be a history of the world looked at from the view of Adam Smith, von Clausewitz, and and whatever. I had mentioned one more, but I'm blocking the word again. Okay, next question.
And finally, I guess it's more of a parting statement. If you'd like to share anything with our listeners, those people who look up to you in the economics field or who are new to this and are trying to discover it, have you any parting wisdom or any advice in terms of the discipline or even life?
Yeah. I'm continually disturbed about you talking about economics. The field is economics. My field is philosophy.
Okay.
Think of Aristotle. He was into everything, and the everything helped. One field helps another. Now think with my personal field. When I was, in high school, I was a nerd. I was especially interested in philosophical ways. What do we know and how do we know it? When I went to the University of Chicago, got into the economics department, that naturally I was interested in the economics of uncertainty. When I read John Burr Williams' later Theory of Investment Value, he said the value of a stock is the present value of its future returns. But what about the uncertainty and so on? So just asking the question, what do we know and how do we know it, which is a philosophical question, is what made me do something which changed economics. Mm-hmm. And right now I'm writing a 4-volume book, as I say. Volume 1, The Theory of Rational Decision Making. There's not subtitles, but if you actually look at the prefaces to each of the volumes, Volume 1 is The Theory of Rational Decision Making, single period, no nods. The Volume 2 is to do with, many period no nods, so the Bayesian, dynamic programming and Bayesian analysis and so on is in there. And Volume 3 has to do with the uncertainty. And the first chapter of Volume 3 is, what the philosophers say? What did Hume say? And so and so on, Descartes and Peirce and so on say. When you get to volume chapter 16, what do I say? Anyway, so and it's just a little different than what they say. So the point is, if you want to understand economics, understand the world and how it works.
That's true, and it's something I discovered through this podcast, speaking to amazing people all the way through. Philosophy seems to be one foundation that has got people's attention, and it's about talking about behaviours or the human experience, and all the way from Deirdre McCloskey to quite recently Tyler Cowen and Arjo Clammer. Right. The draw is in philosophy, and I guess its foundations, not its foundations, obviously, as you're going back hundreds of years, but our introduction in the discipline is through Adam Smith.
Yeah, I'm not a bit surprised. It seems to be the common experience. So I think I thank you for the great questions, and I better go back to work and earn some money.
Hardy, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much. And I hope it's okay for me to say you are an economic rock star, even though you are into philosophy.
That's fine. That's just fine, Frank. Thanks a million.
It's a pleasure. Thanks very much, Harry.
Thank you, Frank. Bye now.
All the best. Good day then. Bye. Economic Rockstar is a free podcast that does not exclude anyone from listening as long as they have a device to listen, download or stream. I have many listeners from all parts of the world, and I truly am pleased to know that the Economic Rockstar podcast unites all of you through the common theme of economics. I strive to commit to releasing an episode each week and aim to develop Economic Rockstar into much more than just a podcast. Patreon is a platform that gives you, the listener of the Economic Rockstar podcast, the opportunity to express your appreciation of the show by committing a financial reward for as little as $1 a month. Patreon allows me, the creator of the Economic Rockstar podcast, to be rewarded and paid by you so I can continue with the running costs of the show and to reinvest and expand the podcast into other platforms or mediums in the future. To find out more on how you can help the Economic Rockstar podcast and have your name added to the supporters list on my website, please check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/Economic Rockstar or visit the supporters page on the Economic Rockstar website. If you enjoyed this podcast, why not leave some feedback or comments on the show notes page on economicrockstar.com, where you can also sign up and be a member of the Economic Rockstar community. If you're listening to this episode on iTunes or Stitcher Radio, I would love to have some feedback and for you to leave an honest rating and review, as this will help with the rankings of the show so that more people can find it. If you're listening on the website economicrockstar.com, make sure you check out the back catalogue of all previous episodes and interviews with some amazing professors and authors at economicrockstar.com/podcasts. Thanks for listening, and I really appreciate your loyal support. I know how much you love audio, so why not get a free audiobook with Economic Rockstar today? I've teamed up with audiobooks.com to bring you this amazing offer. Visit audiobooks.com/rockstar to download your free audiobook now.